a motivated young doctor facing the battle of her career, a scheming senior physician and his loyal followers, driven by jealousy and prejudice, ready to do whatever it takes to ruin her. Dr. Mia is talented and ambitious, and finally getting the recognition she deserves. But her road to success is littered with traps, betrayal, and impossible choices, with colleagues plotting against her and mistakes haunting her every step. Will Mia overcome the dark forces at her hospital, rise above her setbacks, and claim the position she's earned? Or will her dreams collapse under the weight of lies, manipulation, and a chilling conspiracy? Dr. Gray wasn't exactly the type of person you'd expect to throw a welcome party for newcomers, especially if they didn't fit his rigid idea of the norm. And when Dr. Mia Thompson, a young, black female doctor, joined the hospital, she was in for a rude awakening. She was brilliant, kind, and eager to make her mark. But Gray? He wasn't about to make her journey easy. To him, Mia's arrival wasn't just a new hire, it was a disruption, a challenge to his unspoken belief that Eldergrove and its hospital should stay the way they'd always been. Mia found herself the target of his thinly veiled comments and stinging sarcasm almost daily. She tried to brush it off at first, but his remarks grew sharper, more personal. Colleagues noticed, nurses whispered, some feeling uncomfortable, others too nervous to step in. Dr. Emily Wu, a sharp-witted intern, often exchanged tense glances with Mia, showing silent support but too junior herself to confront Gray openly. And then there was Jack, a seasoned paramedic with a reputation for speaking his mind. He wasn't the type to let Gray's behavior slide, and his patience was wearing thin. But things really escalated one evening when Gray's behavior took a more aggressive turn. After a long shift, he cornered Mia with a tirade about knowing her place, peppered with remarks that left no question about his racist attitude. Mia stood her ground, but the look in her eyes signaled that she was shaken. Jack, watching from down the hall, decided enough was enough. With the hospital buzzing over the incident, other staff began to speak up, sharing stories of their own experiences with Gray's toxic behavior. Dr. Wu confided to Mia about her own encounters with his bullying. As Gray realized he was losing his grip, he became even more unpredictable, even reckless. Just when it seemed like the walls were closing in on him, Gray decided to take matters into his own hands, throwing one last desperate punch to preserve his authority. But Mia, Jack, and Dr. Wu had other plans, and they weren't backing down. The senior doctor who once ruled the ward was about to learn the hard way that sometimes change is unstoppable. It was the middle of the night when the emergency team wheeled in an accident victim, a middle-aged woman with deep bruises, a fractured leg, and a head injury. Her car had swerved off the road, colliding head-on with a tree, and the damage was severe. She was unconscious, hooked up to machines, and in desperate need of surgery. Dr. Gray, naturally, took charge, barking orders as the surgical team scrambled into action. Dr. Mia Thompson was there too, calm and steady, ready to do her part. She had already assessed the patient's CT scans and saw a potential issue: internal bleeding near the liver that needed immediate attention. As they scrubbed in, Dr. Wu and Jack exchanged a glance. They both knew Gray's attitude was going to make this procedure even more challenging than it already was. But there was no room for mistakes tonight. Every second counted.
All right, folks.
Gray's voice rang out, filled with a smug confidence.
We're going to fix this woman up, no matter what. And remember, this is my oar. I call the shots.
Just as they were about to start, Mia spoke up, her tone calm but assertive.
Dr. Gray, I noticed bleeding in the liver area that might need to be addressed before we focus on the leg fracture. Otherwise, we risk.
Gray cut her off with a dismissive wave.
I've been doing this for 30 years, Dr. Thompson. I know how to handle a simple trauma case.
Dr. Wu raised an eyebrow and glanced at Mia, who bit her lip but stayed focused. Jack muttered under his breath, clearly annoyed but knowing better than to stir things up right now. They had a life to save. The surgery was tense. Gray was determined to focus on what he deemed important: the leg fracture, despite Mia's continued concerns. She could feel the frustration building up, but she wasn't about to abandon her post. As the minutes passed, the monitors started beeping. Mia knew her instincts were right. The bleeding was getting worse, and fast.
Dr. Gray.
She tried again, her voice a bit sharper this time.
We have to address the liver, now.
Gray's eyes narrowed, but before he could retort, the accident victim stirred on the table. Her eyes fluttered open, dazed and confused. The room went silent as she looked around, taking in the faces above her until her gaze landed on Mia.
What are you doing here?
The woman stammered, her voice weak but laced with something darker, almost like fear or anger.
I don't want someone like you touching me.
Mia took a deep breath, staying professional despite the sting of those words. Gray couldn't hide his smirk.
See,
he sneered quietly to Mia.
Maybe the patient knows what's best for her.
The other doctors exchanged shocked glances, but Mia stayed steady, her focus unwavering. Ignoring the insults, she addressed Dr. Wu and Jack.
We need to stop the bleeding before it's too late. Dr. Wu, can you assist?
Dr. Wu didn't hesitate.
Absolutely.
She said, stepping forward, ready to assist Mia with the bleeding. Gray stepped back, seething as Mia took charge. But the patient, though barely conscious, continued to mumble protests, making it clear she wanted no help from a black doctor. The tension in the room was thick as Mia and Dr. Wu worked together to control the bleeding, every move quick and precise. Finally, as the monitors stabilized, Gray's anger boiled over.
This is outrageous.
He snapped, his voice barely contained.
Taking over my oar? Do you think you know better than me?
Mia met his gaze, her eyes fierce but calm.
Dr. Gray, we're here to save lives, not cater to personal biases. If we didn't act, she could have died.
The entire team was silent, their respect for Mia evident as she stood her ground, the tension dissolving into something powerful. Gray, caught off guard by the sudden solidarity in the room, turned away, muttering under his breath. Jack broke the silence with a chuckle.
Guess we know who the real boss is around here,
he said, giving Mia a nod of respect. As they wrapped up the surgery, Mia knew things would never be the same. Gray's authority was fading, and Eldergrove Hospital was finally waking up to the idea that true leadership wasn't about control or power, it was about doing what was right. And as for Mia, she had proved once and for all that she wasn't going anywhere. 2 days after the grueling surgery, the patient's vitals suddenly crashed. Alarms blared, and the nurses rushed into her room, finding her pale, with a pulse so faint it was barely there. They immediately paged Dr. Mia, who was on her way to another department meeting. As soon as she heard the page, she sprinted down the hall, pushing past the crowd of curious onlookers who had gathered, her mind already racing through possible complications. Dr. Gray was there first, peering over the patient with a frown. When Mia entered, he glared at her.
Look who finally decided to show up.
He snapped.
I knew this would happen. You didn't follow procedure in the surgery. I warned you that rushing into things would cause problems.
Mia ignored him and went straight to work, quickly assessing the patient's condition. The nurses hung on her every word as she directed them, maintaining her calm and staying focused even as Gray continued his tirade.
This is unbelievable.
Gray sneered, pacing around the room with his arms crossed.
I've worked here for years without a single incident, and now look at the mess we're in, thanks to your brilliant ideas.
Mia, barely listening, kept her attention on the patient. She checked the incisions and noticed something strange. There was a deep bruising pattern on the lower abdomen, a sign of internal bleeding, and not in an area that she or Dr. Wu had operated on. Mia's mind raced. If there was internal bleeding there, it had to be from the section Gray had insisted on handling alone.
Dr. Gray,
Mia said firmly, finally looking up.
The complication is coming from the area where you worked on the fracture. There's hemorrhaging in the abdominal wall. This needs immediate intervention.
Gray's face flushed.
Don't you dare pin this on me.
He snapped, his voice loud enough to turn heads outside the room.
You're the one responsible for this. I'll make sure everyone knows it.
Ignoring him, Mia leaned over the patient and started the resuscitation protocol, pressing her hands firmly over the patient's chest and counting each compression, every movement precise and steady. The nurses watched, their breaths held, as Mia worked with unwavering focus. After what felt like forever, the patient's pulse returned. The monitors beeped in steady rhythm, and a collective sigh of relief filled the room. But Mia wasn't done. She was determined to find and fix the exact cause of the bleed. With quick instructions to the team, she organized an emergency scan to locate and contain the hemorrhage. Gray watched, his anger simmering under the surface as the scan confirmed Mia's suspicions. It was a clear error from his procedure. Realizing that Mia had not only saved the patient but also exposed his mistake, Gray's face twisted with fury.
This is a setup.
He barked, his voice trembling with anger.
You're trying to make me look like a fool, and I won't stand for it. You think you can just come in here and…
Before he could finish, the hospital's chief of staff, Dr. Spencer Hayes, appeared in the doorway. He'd heard the commotion and seen the cluster of staff and onlookers who had gathered in the hallway, their faces filled with a mixture of shock and curiosity.
Dr. Gray,
Hayes said, his voice firm but calm.
I'd like a word with you. Now.
Gray huffed, his eyes flashing with resentment, but he followed Hayes down the hall. As the door closed behind them, the waiting staff and nurses exchanged relieved glances. For years, Gray's word had been taken as gospel, his authority unchallenged. But now, it was clear that his error had put the patient in serious danger, and Mia had saved her life. An hour later, word spread that the board had issued Gray an official warning, demanding that he maintain professionalism and reminding him of the hospital's commitment to collaboration and respect. But instead of cooling down, Gray grew more enraged. He stormed through the halls, muttering threats about how he'd make Mia regret crossing him. Staff members dodged out of his path, exchanging worried glances, wondering how far Gray would go to protect his pride. Back in the recovery room, Mia was by the patient's side, updating the chart and monitoring her vitals. Jack and Dr. Wu stood nearby, both of them giving her silent nods of respect.
You did it, Mia.
Jack said quietly.
You proved yourself, no matter what Gray says.
Mia smiled, a sense of accomplishment filling her despite the turmoil. She knew this was just the beginning of the battle with Gray, but she also knew she wasn't alone, and that with every success, his influence over the hospital's culture weakened just a little more. Days after Dr. Gray's public humiliation, he was still seething. While he had managed to keep his anger somewhat concealed, his allies at the hospital were well aware of his resentment. Two senior nurses, Margaret and Linda, who had worked with him for years and shared his outdated views, approached him in the staff lounge one evening.
Dr. Gray.
Margaret began in a hushed voice, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard.
I just want you to know we're with you. Mia's been nothing but trouble since she got here, and the way she humiliated you, well, it was just wrong.
Linda nodded, a conspiratorial glint in her eye.
We're here if you need us.
She added.
You shouldn't have to put up with this alone. Just say the word, and we'll make sure she doesn't get too comfortable around here.
A sly grin crept onto Dr. Gray's face. An idea sparked. He knew he couldn't take Mia down alone, but with the help of Margaret and Linda, he could finally be rid of her. He leaned in close, his voice low and venomous.
Ladies,
he said smoothly.
I think it's time we remind Dr. Thompson that she's not as untouchable as she thinks. I have a plan, but it's going to need some subtlety.
The nurses listened eagerly, nodding in agreement, and within minutes their alliance was set. The following week, an attending doctor, Dr. Wilson, called in sick unexpectedly. Dr. Mia was asked to step in and cover his patients for the day. She accepted without hesitation, knowing she was more than capable. Among the patients was a young black boy, Jordan, who had been brought in with a mild respiratory infection. Mia conducted a thorough examination, carefully reviewed his charts, and ordered the appropriate medication. But Margaret, on duty that day, saw this as the perfect opportunity. She slipped into the medication room, carefully selecting a drug she knew would worsen Jordan's symptoms. With a quick glance to make sure no one was watching, she swapped Mia's prescribed medication for a stronger, incorrect dosage. Hours later, Mia received a page. Jordan was in distress, his heart rate dangerously low, his breathing labored. Mia rushed to his room, her mind racing. She checked his charts and confirmed her initial prescription. Everything had been in order. But as she examined him, a nagging suspicion gnawed at her something wasn't adding up. Dr. Gray soon heard the commotion and wasted no time swooping in. He marched into the room, his voice dripping with faux concern.
Dr. Thompson, I warned you about rushing your treatments.
He sneered, loud enough for the other staff to hear.
This is exactly why protocols are in place, and why inexperienced doctors like yourself shouldn't take liberties. The boy's life is now at risk because of your negligence.
Mia was speechless, her cheeks burning as the nurses in the hallway watched. But she kept her focus, determined to stabilize Jordan first. With every action she took, however, she felt Gray's accusations sinking deeper, chipping away at her confidence. The hospital board convened an investigation the next day. Dr. Gray, feigning a wounded sense of duty, brought forward his concerns about Mia's handling of the case. He painted a grim picture, accusing her of negligence and recklessness. The board, needing to take these matters seriously, decided to place Mia on temporary suspension pending the investigation. Mia's heart sank as she packed up her things, her mind swirling with disbelief and anger. How could everything go so wrong when she'd done nothing wrong? But not long after, the tide began to turn. Dr. Wilson, the original attending doctor, returned and immediately reviewed Jordan's records. He noted something strange and unusual medication had been administered, one he'd never prescribed. Intrigued, he dug deeper, carefully piecing together Jordan's treatment timeline. What he found was shocking: the medication did not match Mia's original orders. Dr. Wilson reported his findings to the board, who called in Margaret for questioning. At first, she played innocent, but as the questions intensified and the inconsistencies in her story piled up, she crumbled. With trembling hands, she admitted to intentionally switching the medication.
I just wanted her gone.
Margaret confessed, her voice barely a whisper.
I thought if she made a serious enough mistake, we'd be rid of her. I couldn't stand her being here, disrupting everything.
The board members exchanged glances, some in shock, others with anger simmering just below the surface. When they pressed her on whether she'd acted alone, Margaret's gaze flickered, a momentary hesitation. But she clenched her jaw, refusing to betray Dr. Gray and Linda.
I worked alone.
She insisted, her voice stronger now, as if determined to protect her accomplices. The board issued a strict reprimand to Margaret and assured Mia that the suspension would be lifted immediately. Dr. Mia was reinstated with an official apology from the board, though the damage had been done. As word of the investigation's outcome spread through the hospital, Dr. Gray's fury grew. He knew that his plan had failed, but with Margaret's silence, he was safe, for now. But his frustration only made him more determined to rid himself of Mia once and for all, his hatred consuming him like a dark cloud as he plotted his next move. Dr. Gray's frustration was reaching a fever pitch, and he could barely keep himself composed. The opportunity to finally end Dr. Mia's career had been right in front of him, but once again, the outcome was far from what he'd hoped. As he stormed out of the board meeting, his face twisted in rage. The thought of her being given a mere suspension and psychological counseling was an insult. She was supposed to be gone, her reputation shredded beyond repair. Back in the hallway, he could still hear the whispers. Colleagues, junior doctors, and even nurses exchanged uneasy glances as Dr. Gray stormed past, muttering under his breath. No one dared cross him, but the whispers that trailed him showed a growing unease with his behavior. And while he reveled in the fear he instilled in others, it only heightened his fury that Mia's suspension hadn't gone far enough.
She's unfit, a complete liability.
He hissed to Margaret, who happened to be passing by. Margaret nodded supportively, her face pale. The board's decision to keep Mia on staff gnawed at him, and he couldn't resist venting to anyone who would listen.
I've given this hospital my best years. If they're willing to overlook this kind of incompetence, then maybe I need to take my concerns higher.
Margaret patted his arm sympathetically.
The board doesn't appreciate all you've done, Dr. Gray. Mia's a disaster waiting to happen.
Dr. Gray's mind raced. The petition to the medical board hadn't worked, but he still had leverage. He could reach out to influential colleagues, friends in high places, and launch a campaign against Mia. He'd have them review every decision she'd made, every step she'd taken since joining the hospital. If he could find even a single mistake to add to this incident, he might still ruin her. Meanwhile, Dr. Mia sat in her small, dimly lit office, reeling from the incident in the operating room. She knew she had faltered, and the 3-week suspension felt like both a reprieve and a punishment. The psychologist's sessions felt daunting, but the idea of losing her career over this was unbearable. Jack, the paramedic, knocked gently on her door, breaking her spiraling thoughts.
Hey, Doc. Doc,
He said, his voice filled with warmth.
I just heard what happened. You know, you're one of the best people here. Don't let that jerk Gray get in your head.
She managed a small, grateful smile.
Thanks, Jack. It's just, I don't know how I lost control like that. It was as if I blanked, completely froze up. I've never experienced anything like it.
Jack gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder.
That kind of pressure can mess with anyone's head. It's a tough job, and we've all had those moments. Take this time to regroup. Don't let Gray make you doubt yourself. You're here for a reason.
As the days passed, Dr. Mia poured herself into her sessions with the psychologist, determined to overcome her self-doubt. She studied her medical notes, reviewed every case meticulously, and immersed herself in preparing for her return. Meanwhile, Dr. Gray was making moves of his own, whispering in influential ears, planting seeds of doubt among the board members, and compiling every misstep he could attribute to her. But Gray hadn't counted on one thing: the support Dr. Mia was quietly building among the hospital staff. Jack had been talking to other colleagues, sharing how Gray had crossed boundaries more than once. Stories began circulating, anecdotes of Gray's harsh criticisms and undermining tactics, his mistreatment of other doctors, and his self-serving attitude. Slowly but surely, Gray's reputation was crumbling from within. Finally, Mia returned, a new resolve burning in her. She had learned a lot from her time away, not just about her own abilities, but about her strength in the face of adversity. Gray's cold glares and biting remarks no longer shook her. In fact, his actions seemed more desperate than powerful now, and the rest of the hospital could sense it too. During a routine staff meeting, Dr. Gray couldn't resist taking a jab at Mia, accusing her once again of being unfit. But this time, she didn't stay silent. Mia took a deep breath and stood up, her gaze unwavering.
Dr. Gray, I respect your experience,
She began, her voice calm but firm.
but I will not allow anyone to undermine my competence. I may have stumbled, but I learned from it. This hospital needs collaboration, not division, and I'm committed to giving my best to my patients and my colleagues.
A stunned silence filled the room. For the first time, Dr. Gray's authority had been challenged publicly, and he could feel the shift. The nurses exchanged approving glances, And even some of the senior doctors nodded subtly, impressed by her courage. Dr. Gray's face darkened, and he clenched his fists. He'd lost control of the situation, and for the first time, he began to wonder if his grip on the hospital was slipping for good. Later that day, in the dim, secluded corner of the hospital cafeteria, Dr. Gray and Nurse Linda leaned close, whispering in hushed voices. Their eyes glinted with a shared purpose, a determination that stemmed from their growing animosity toward Dr. Mia. As they exchanged heated words, their goal was clear: Mia had to go, but not without a carefully orchestrated fall from grace. They planned to strip her of her allies on the hospital board, sow seeds of mistrust, and ultimately have her license revoked. It was no longer just about getting rid of her, it was about complete and utter destruction. They plotted meticulously, with Linda taking the lead on executing their dirty work. She would stir up rumors, casting doubt about Mia's intentions and abilities. Gray leaned back, his voice a low growl.
We need to make her look like a threat to everyone here. Isolate her first, divide and conquer. Then, when she's weak and alone, we'll crush her.
Their meeting over, they headed out to a nearby motel under the cover of night. Their twisted bond, fueled by mutual resentment and contempt, had drawn them into a strange, passionate affair. Despite both being in their 50s and married, they found themselves breaking every moral and ethical boundary. The fact that their hatred for Mia had led to this only seemed to deepen their connection. The next morning, they arrived at work, their plan firmly in motion. Linda wasted no time spreading vile rumors, her words laced with venom. "Did you hear what Dr. Mia said about some of us?" she whispered to a group of nurses. "She's been talking about replacing half the staff with black nurses and doctors. Thinks she can just come in and change everything, though absurd." Her accusations struck a nerve. The hospital staff began to cast suspicious glances at Mia, their trust in her wavering as Linda continued to spin her lies. Even some of Mia's closest colleagues began to withdraw. The accusations piled up, and whispers of betrayal filled the halls. By the end of the week, Mia was struggling under the weight of isolation and suspicion, her usual confidence shaken. The once warm camaraderie she shared with her team was vanishing, replaced by doubt and hostility. But Linda's plan didn't stop there. She took it a step further, sneaking stolen items from the supply closet into Mia's locker. When the items were discovered, a small investigation was launched, and suspicion fell squarely on Mia. However, security footage revealed Linda slipping the items in, her face barely concealed. While she avoided direct punishment, the ruse was exposed as a setup, leaving Linda scrambling to maintain her reputation. When Gray realized Linda's sabotage wasn't taking Mia down fast enough, he resorted to something darker. One evening, he waited for Mia to leave her car unattended, then quietly tampered with the brakes, ensuring that she'd be helpless once she hit the road. Later that night, Mia's car swerved off the road as her brakes failed, resulting in a terrifying crash. She was rushed back to the hospital she'd just left, her injuries severe but not fatal. Colleagues and friends were shaken by the sight of her battered body, but even in her vulnerable state, Mia's resilience shone through. As the investigation into the accident began, hospital security reviewed recent footage. Gray's shady activity near Mia's car, combined with Linda's earlier actions, painted a damning picture. The truth unraveled rapidly, exposing not only their plot to ruin Mia, but their sordid affair as well. Both Gray and Linda were brought before the board, and their licenses were promptly suspended. The scandal didn't end there. Their marriages imploded as their spouses filed for divorce, and soon after, both were tried and sentenced for attempting to take Mia's life. At Dr. Gray's, the courtroom was silent, the judge's gaze piercing as he looked down upon him. Gray sat with his jaw clenched, the bitterness unmistakable in his expression as he tried to defend himself one last time. Judge.
Dr. Gray, you've been presented with overwhelming evidence. The CCTV footage, the witness testimonies, the tampered brake system, these are not baseless claims.
Dr. Gray with a sneer.
Your Honor, all of it is because of her. That woman, Mia. She's poisoned the whole hospital, twisted everyone against me. She's incompetent, reckless. I'm the real victim here.
Judge unmoved.
The evidence says otherwise. Your actions were deliberate, calculated, and entirely malicious.
Dr. Gray desperate.
You don't understand. She's unfit to be in that position, unfit to even hold a license. That hospital, it was a place of respect until she walked in. This is bigger than these so-called accusations. She's a danger to medicine, and no one sees it.
Judge.
Dr. Gray, your hatred has blinded you. This trial is not about Dr. Mia Thompson. It's about you and the harm you caused. You are hereby sentenced to the maximum penalty for attempted murder and professional misconduct.
Gray's face fell, the reality of his actions finally sinking in. His mouth twisted as he was led out of the courtroom, still muttering bitterly under his breath.
This isn't over. Not while I still have breath in me.
In his cramped prison cell, Dr. Gray's bitterness only festered. Each day behind bars seemed to deepen his resentment, and every letter he wrote to the medical board became darker, more fervent, like a man clutching at the last remnants of his pride. It didn't matter that he had lost his career, his license, and his family. In his mind, there was still one last battle to win, ensuring Dr. Mia would never know peace in her new role as chief of surgery. Week after week, he penned venomous letters, detailing exaggerated misdeeds and imaginary failures that he claimed Mia had committed in her rise to the top. He insisted her appointment was a disgrace, a reckless decision by the board that would bring ruin to the hospital. He cited her one moment of hesitation during the surgery, the single slip that he had saved as evidence of her incompetence. His hatred was palpable in every scrawled word, as if he believed he could claw his way out of his fate by tearing down Mia's success. Despite the walls that confined him, Gray's letters persisted like a bitter echo, his twisted vendetta spilling onto paper. But as the months turned to years, his words began to fade in influence. The board stopped acknowledging him, tired of the incessant grievances from a man whose own actions had condemned him. After 6 long months of recovery and perseverance, Dr. Mia Thompson stood once more in the bustling hospital corridor. Her colleagues gathered around, some with tears of joy, others with smiles of admiration. Dr. Wu.
Mia, welcome back. We've missed you. The hospital hasn't been the same without you.
Dr. Mia smiling warmly.
Thank you, Dr. Wu. I've missed you all too. It's been a tough journey, but I'm ready to get back and serve this place our place.
Jack grinning.
You don't know how much of an inspiration you've been, Doc. Through everything, you kept your head high. We're all proud to work under you, Chief.
Dr. Mia taking a deep breath.
I appreciate every one of you. This isn't just my comeback, it's ours. We're here to bring hope, healing, and unity. And no matter who tries to divide us, we're going to keep moving forward.
The crowd erupted in applause, their faith in her stronger than ever. As Mia looked around, she felt a profound sense of peace. She had weathered the storm, and she was ready to lead with compassion and strength. In that moment, she knew no one, not even Dr. Gray from his prison cell, could ever take this away from her. In the end, Gray's obsession with Mia became his prison within a prison. He could no longer reach her, no longer manipulate or control the world he once commanded. Mia's career blossomed, her leadership respected by all, while he remained trapped, isolated, bitter, and forgotten. The irony was undeniable. The more he tried to pull her down, the higher she rose, leaving him with nothing but his own unquenchable hatred to keep him company. Do you think Dr. Gray could ever see Dr. Mia in a different light? Let us know your opinions in the comments below.